Operation Gold, the Berlin Tunnel. On the morning of April 22, 1956, Soviet soldiers made a discovery that would become one of the most famous intelligence operations of the Cold War. 450 meters into East Berlin, beneath a street called Schönefelder Chaussee, they found something extraordinary: a sophisticated American tunnel, packed with recording equipment, tapping directly into their military communication cables. The Soviets were shocked. The Americans were devastated. Their most audacious intelligence operation had been exposed. But here's what neither side knew in that moment. This story wasn't what either of them thought it was. To understand Operation Gold, we need to go back to 1952, to the peculiar geography of Cold War Berlin. Berlin sat 160 kilometers inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the city itself was split four ways between the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. This created a unique intelligence opportunity and a massive challenge. The Soviets ran their military communications through landline cables, not radio. This was smart. Radio could be intercepted from anywhere, but cables were buried underground. To tap them, you'd need physical access. And most of those cables ran through East Berlin, territory the Western Allies couldn't access. In 1952, the British had obtained Soviet cable layouts from sources in the East German Postal Service. These showed exactly where major Soviet military communication lines ran through East Berlin. The cable diagrams showed something remarkable. Several major Soviet communication lines converged at a point just inside East Berlin, close to the sector boundary with the American zone. If you could dig a tunnel from the American sector, stay underground past the border, you could theoretically reach those cables. Bill Harvey had arrived in Berlin in 1952 as the CIA's Berlin base chief. He was the agency's master of technical operations, known for carrying 2 guns at all times and maintaining an impressive alcohol intake. His British counterparts found him brilliant and exhausting in equal measure. Harvey had studied the British success in Vienna, where they'd run Operation Silver, and saw an opportunity to replicate it on a larger scale. It was audacious. It was nearly impossible. It would cost millions. They decided to do it. The operation became a joint CIA-British SIS project, codenamed Operation Gold by the Americans and Operation Stopwatch by the British. The British contributed their cable intelligence and technical expertise from Vienna. The CIA would handle construction and provide most of the funding, about $6.7 million in 1950s money. But they had a problem beyond the technical challenge. They needed absolute secrecy. Even within the intelligence community, only a handful of people could know. One of those people was George Blake, a talented young SIS officer assigned to the Berlin station. Blake spoke fluent Russian and German. He'd survived Japanese POW camps in World War II and North Korean captivity during the Korean War. He was trusted. He attended the planning meetings at Carlton Gardens in London, took minutes, and locked up the papers afterward. What no one knew: George Blake had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1951 while imprisoned in North Korea. He was a KGB agent. And he told his handlers everything. The Americans needed a cover story. In September 1954, they began building a warehouse and radar station in Rudow, right on the edge of the American sector. It looked like a standard military facility, but the real purpose was hidden. Beneath the warehouse, they were digging. The tunnel would need to be 450 meters long, roughly 5 football fields. It would start in the basement of the warehouse, cross under the sector boundary, and continue deep into East Berlin to reach the cable junction. The engineering challenges were immense. The tunnel needed to be deep enough to avoid detection, but shallow enough to reach the cables. Too much vibration during digging would alert the Soviets above. The excavated soil, over 3,100 tons, had to be disposed of secretly. They dug using hand tools and small electric equipment, working 24 hours a day. The tunnel was 6 feet high, just wide enough for a person to stand. They installed steel supports, ventilation, and lighting. The dirt was hidden within the warehouse compound, mixed with concrete and used as foundation material. At the end of the tunnel, engineers built a vertical tap chamber. This shaft went up to reach the cables just beneath the street. The chamber was lined with soundproofing. They couldn't risk any noise leaking upward. The technical sophistication was remarkable. They didn't just tap the cables. They built an entire underground listening post, multiple amplifiers, hundreds of tape recorders, a continuous recording operation that ran 24 hours a day. In late February 1955, after 5 months of construction, the tunnel was complete. On the night of May 11th, a team broke through to the cables and attached the taps. Operation Gold was operational. Here's what makes this story so strange. The Soviets almost certainly knew about the tunnel before the first shovel of dirt was moved. George Blake had told them. He'd attended the planning meetings. He knew the route, the timing, everything. So why did the Soviets let it happen? The most accepted theory is protection of their source. If the Soviets had somehow discovered the tunnel during construction, it would have been one of the greatest intelligence coups in history. But if they shut it down too early before it was even operational, someone might ask, how did they know? Blake was too valuable to risk exposing. So, the theory goes, they let the operation proceed. But if they knew about the tunnel, did they change what they transmitted? Did they feed false information through those cables? The evidence suggests they didn't. The KGB made a calculated decision. They told no one in Germany about the taps, not the East Germans, not even the Soviet military units whose communications were being intercepted. They kept the information flow normal to protect Blake. Their own high-level sensitive communications went through separate overhead lines that couldn't be tapped. What we do know is what the Americans recorded. For 11 months, from May 1955 to April 1956, the tunnel recorded everything that passed through those Soviet cables. The numbers are staggering. 443,000 conversations, 50,000 reels of magnetic tape, about 25 tons, 3 major Soviet communication cables, carrying both telephone and telegraph traffic. The tapes were flown to London and Washington for processing. Teams of translators and analysts worked through them for years. The British operation in London employed 317 people at peak. The Americans in Washington employed 350. The final product filled over 1,750 summary reports. But what did it actually reveal? The intelligence was granular and operational rather than strategic. Order of battle information, which units were where, what equipment they had, command structures, biographical details on thousands of Soviet military personnel, technical specifications of Soviet military equipment, communications procedures and protocols, disagreements between Soviet and East German authorities over West Berlin policy. It wasn't nuclear secrets or war plans. It was the bureaucratic detail of how the Soviet military actually functioned in East Germany, and that had value. For Western intelligence, understanding Soviet military organization meant better assessment of their capabilities and intentions. The tunnel provided confirmation of things suspected and revealed gaps in Western knowledge. CIA Director Allen Dulles called it one of the most valuable and daring projects ever undertaken. But was this worth the risk and cost? The tunnel's discovery came on the night of April 21st to 22nd, 1956, Easter weekend. Soviet and East German repair crews were digging near Schonefelder Chaussee, investigating a cable fault. In the early morning hours of April 22nd, their excavation broke through into the American tap chamber. What happened next is a matter of some debate. The official Soviet story is that this was pure accident. They were repairing cables and stumbled onto the tunnel. But the timing raises questions. Some historians believe the KGB finally decided Blake's cover was secure enough, or that they needed the propaganda victory. The Soviets moved quickly. They photographed everything, documented the entire installation, and on Monday, April 23rd, invited the entire Berlin press corps for their first international press conference in 11 years of occupation. In subsequent weeks, approximately 50,000 East Berliners were bussed through to witness the treachery of the West. The propaganda effort spectacularly backfired. The Western press coverage was mixed, but much of it marveled at the operation's audacity and technical ingenuity. Some portrayed it as an embarrassing failure, but others called it an incredible feat of engineering and daring. The very audacity of the operation earned grudging respect and enhanced the CIA's reputation for technical prowess. For the CIA and SIS, the emotions were complicated. Yes, they'd been discovered. Yes, 11 months wasn't as long as they'd hoped to operate, but they'd gathered an enormous amount of intelligence, and as far as they could tell, it was genuine. The operation was classified top secret. The actual intelligence value remained unknown to the public for decades. The CIA couldn't defend the operation's worth without revealing what they'd learned. And then, 5 years later, everything changed again. In April 1961, George Blake was arrested in London. A Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski, who had become a triple agent, had exposed him. British signals intelligence confirmed the information. Blake confessed. He'd been a Soviet agent since 1951. He'd betrayed dozens of British operations and agents. Some of those agents had died. At his trial in May 1961, Blake received 42 years in prison, the longest non-life sentence in British history. His activities were divided into 5 time periods, charged as 5 separate offenses. He received 14 years consecutively on 3 counts, plus 14 years concurrently on 2 others. Newspapers reported this represented 1 year for each agent he'd betrayed, though this appears to be journalistic speculation rather than the actual legal reasoning. The number Blake betrayed remains disputed. British authorities said at least 40 agents, though Blake himself later claimed 500 to 600. And yes, he'd told the Soviets about Operation Gold before the tunnel was even dug. The revelation forced a complete reassessment. If the Soviets knew about the tunnel from the beginning, how should Western intelligence evaluate everything they'd recorded? Were those 443,000 conversations genuine? Or had the Soviets carefully controlled what passed through those cables, feeding the Americans exactly what they wanted them to hear? Here's where the story gets genuinely complex. The intelligence community's answer was probably real, actually. Several factors supported this. First, the sheer volume and mundane detail of the conversations. Manufacturing 11 months of fake military communications would have been an incredible undertaking. Thousands of Soviet personnel keeping up elaborate performances on every phone call. Second, much of the intelligence was confirmatory. It matched or clarified things Western intelligence already suspected. If the Soviets were making it all up, they would have needed to know exactly what the West already knew to make it convincing. Third, and perhaps most telling, after Blake's exposure, the Soviets never claimed the tunnel was an elaborate deception. If they'd pulled off that kind of counterintelligence triumph, why not boast about it? The most likely explanation, the KGB leadership decided to let the operation run to protect Blake, but they didn't orchestrate an elaborate deception. The communications were genuine. The Soviets accepted the intelligence loss as the price of keeping their valuable mole in place. Was that the right decision? From the Soviet perspective, probably yes. Blake continued to work for Soviet intelligence until 1961. Over that decade, he provided information about British operations across Europe. The damage he did vastly exceeded what the Americans learned from 11 months of telephone taps. Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison in October 1966 and fled to Moscow, where he lived until his death in December 2020 at age 98. He never expressed regret. The tunnel site itself is now in reunified Berlin. The Allied Museum in Berlin possesses original tunnel segments. A 7-meter section excavated in 1997 is on permanent display. Additional segments were rediscovered in 2012 in a forest near Passewalk, where East German forces had repurposed them as military shelters. So what's the final assessment of Operation Gold? Was it success or failure? In pure intelligence terms, the tunnel provided valuable operational detail about Soviet military forces in East Germany. It wasn't war-changing intelligence, but it was solid, useful information that informed Western military planning for years. As a technical achievement, it was remarkable, a feat of engineering and operational security that, despite Blake's betrayal, remained undetected for nearly a year of operation. As counterintelligence, it was a catastrophic failure. Blake's presence in the planning meant the operation was compromised before it began. But here's the real legacy. Operation Gold demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of technical intelligence gathering during the Cold War. You could achieve incredible things with enough audacity and resources, but human intelligence, a single well-placed mole, could undermine it all. Two men, Bill Harvey, the American who planned the tunnel, George Blake, the British officer who betrayed it. One believed in technical superiority and American ingenuity. The other believed in ideology and proved that one person with access could compromise the most elaborate operation. Both of them were right. The tunnel stopped operating in April 1956. The tapes were analyzed for years. The full story remained classified for decades. But in the end, Operation Gold became exactly what the Cold War was: brilliant and paranoid, technically impressive and human flawed, successful and compromised, all at once.